Welcome into the Autzen Audibles Podcast, live stream edition Friday, January 6th. I'm at Prehm, Erik Skopil, Jared Mack on the show. And there's a lot to get to on this one. We're going to go through Erik's grades. He's going to pitch us the format here, how we're going to discuss things. And then for the 2022 college football season for the Oregon Ducks. And then the second half of the show, we will dive into just your questions that you guys present to us. So hit the chat. If you're watching this live, hit the chat, drop your questions in. We'll start getting to those here in a second. If you're listening to the podcast post live stream, you can go onto YouTube in the future show formats, and you can find us Oregon Ducks on 24/7 Sports, and subscribe to that YouTube channel. You'll get notified when we go live. We send out links on that as well. And so you can join the show there. Okay, Erik, I'm going to toss it to you. You want to open the show your special way, so let's hear your pitch here.
It wasn't a special way. I just know that grades can be divisive, so I kind of wanted to change the way we opened with this. And
sure.
By the way, great for people listening to us live. I think we're going to make it. This is unofficially Fridays our live stream day, I think. Unofficially, kind of officially. I think that's kind of our plan.
Unofficially official.
Going forward is Friday will be live stream day, probably in the morning around 9:30 a.m. like it is right now. So kind of stay tuned for that. So the way I wanted to do this, and for starters, I guess I'll just provide a little bit of context for how these grades come about. You can find the story on duckterritory.com for those that are maybe in the stream right now. The story is titled Final Grades of Oregon's 10-win 2022 season. So you can go pull that up if you'd like that. If you want context, if you're here just to ask questions later and I'll be boring you with my grade explanation, that's fine too. Basically how this works, I grade every single position group on the team from an A to an F every game. It's a 10, kind of almost a 10-point system, if you will. A plus gets an 11, so it's an extra grade, extra point. So it's kind of on a 1 through a 10 scale to begin with. So how I wanted to start this, and I should note the way I've come to my final season's grade is by adding up all the scores throughout the season, averaging it over the 13 games, coming to a final numerical number, and applying that numerical number with the letter grade. Sort of boring, kind of lame, but that's the way I've done it. If you have suggestions to make it work better next year, I'm totally open to it. If there's someone in the chat who's like, hey, you should do it this way. I'm an educator of some kind. I'm open to listening. But how I wanted to start this was rather than focus on what all the grades were, I wanted to see if I have the order of the position groups correct. I want to see if you agree with the order I have the positions in, at least, and then we can get into the nuance of like, does it feel appropriate for this group to be a B, this group to be a B minus, whatever they are? Mm-hmm. Are we tracking?
Sure.
Does that work?
Yeah, I get that.
Okay. So I have letter grades for the team on the season. I have letter grades for offense. I have letter grades for defense on the season. I have letter grades and for each position groups, including special teams. So I wanted to run through the order I have for the position groups plus special teams. How does this just kind of on initial thought, and I think you guys have probably looked at the grades, so you're already kind of aware what they look like, but just kind of how does this sound? I have running backs as the best position group on the team, offensive line second, quarterback third, pass catchers, which includes receivers and tight ends, fourth, special teams fifth, which I hate saying that already, but that's just the way it came out in the grade machine. And I even commented in my final grades article, I probably graded special teams too loosely
That's too nice. Too nice.
I was too nice to them because in the middle of the year, there was a stretch where it was like, hey, they're doing okay on special teams. They had the UCLA game where they had the onside kick. They had a couple of nice moments. Camden Lewis was consistent. But I think it's too good. Okay.
It's too nice.
Defensively, my order was defensive line, which includes edge players as the best, defensive backs as the second best, linebackers as the worst. And obviously, if you're going from 1 through 8, that would mean that the linebackers are the 8th ranked group on the team. How does that summary, which I just gave, sound to you guys? Does it seem fair that running back was first, offensive line second, quarterback third? And I will note that there is literally 1 point between all three of those, and it changed the order because of the last game where I gave quarterback a B grade and running back an A grade, and that's basically the difference between quarterback and running back being first and third.
I think that's fair. I think I would only swap special teams and defensive line. If you just flip flop those, I'm pretty good with it. Special teams, like I understand that Camden has been really good this year and was good last season, all that good stuff. But punting has been atrocious. Kick return has been atrocious, and even kickoffs have cost Oregon some very valuable field position late in games. So, I mean, that was one of the one of the big picture things that I highlighted at the end of the year, that this needs to be addressed and this needs to be fixed. Defensive line I know they didn't generate any pass rush or anything like that, but it's not like they were just always manhandled like they were against Oregon State. They were competitive. Brandon Dorlus was pretty good. DJ Johnson, when he was healthy, was good. I think I would give them a little more credit, like just because like Jordan Riley and Casey Rogers kind of came out of nowhere to be kind of good contributing members to this defensive front. It was lackluster, but I don't think it was as lackluster as what the special teams was, considering the decent amount of hype that we on this podcast probably generated for the special teams and Coach Joe Loring. And I thought that they just significantly underperformed where we expected them to be last year. So I think everything else is fine. I don't have an issue with running backs being number one. And you mentioned how tightly contested it was for that number one spot. I've got no issues with that. I think it's clear that those four offensive positions are way above anything on defense or special teams. So, I would just flip-flop special teams and defensive line.
So just to clarify before we go to Matt for his review and rebuke of my grades, you still have linebacker and defensive backs worse than special teams, or would you put special teams above either of those groups?
I don't know. Yeah, no, I think that's fine. Okay. I was thinking about defensive backs for a second because you still had Christian Gonzalez and Tre'Quez Bridges got better as of late, but I don't think that Washington game is going to get out of anybody's head anytime soon. So I'll which was highlighted by a poor special teams error on the kickoff by Andrew Boyle. So they're all kind of lumped in together, but those are the bottom three for sure. No questions asked.
I had no issues offensively with your grades. I felt like you could argue any one of the groups, quarterback, running back, pass catchers, offensive line, could have been number one or could have been four. I think you could make a case for any one of those groups. The order, I had no issue. I think running backs, to your point, grading higher maybe than quarterback is sound because I think Oregon had the best 1-2 punch at that position group in the conference. I wonder, or I don't wonder, but I would argue, you could argue that Bo Nix, while he was in that top group at quarterback, it was not a clear cut that he was even top two at his position group.
He wasn't voted that way by the league's coaches.
Yeah. Yeah. So like you could argue maybe that there was a better 1-2 combination, maybe at Oregon State, over Oregon's running backs, but you kind of had like a clear-cut idea that their tandem was at worst the third best, probably the best. You can't say that about Bo Nix. So okay there. I think you were very generous for everybody else on these team grades.
Based on the letter grade, you mean?
Yes.
I agree. We'll get to that.
Based off the letter grade. Defensive line, to Jared's point, like that they didn't really necessarily get manhandled. Well, true. Like statistically, tackles for loss took a big dip from in 2022 to 2021. Their rush defense took a dip from 21 to 2022. We obviously know that sacks was putrid, the lowest number since 1986. So they couldn't get to the quarterback. Their tackles for loss went down. Their yards per carry average allowed went up from 2021 to 2022 with almost the same unit outside of Kayvon Thibodeau. Linebackers
pretty important
were bad.
guy though.
Yeah, but one guy shouldn't just wreak havoc to your entire position group. Like, I understand. Hey, I understand. Like, you lose your pass rush ability, and you can't generate a pass rush because Kayvon Thibodeau's not gone. That's fine, but like, you should still be able to get tackles for loss without Kayvon Thibodeau. You still should be able to get a solid number from a rush defense. I mean, they were like in the 70s, high 70s, almost 80s in rush defense this season. Kayvon Thibodeau, while good against the run, that was not his strength. And so it shouldn't – I guess maybe the loss of Popo factors in there as well because Popo got hurt. But linebackers were not good.
No.
They were terrible. And then
I had linebackers way below everybody else, by the way. We'll get to the actual scores in a moment here. But, like, it was – yeah, they were bad.
I just don't think that there was one position group that should be above B-. And I feel like for special teams and defense, and I feel like B- is even still being kind of nice, in my opinion.
No, and I actually understand that, and kind of in looking through it, the way the grades came to, there's a really large gap from the score perspective that isn't represented very well by the letter grades. So I'm kind of thinking I might readjust some of how the letter grades work next year. It's like, for instance, if you were to hear on a scale of 1 to 10 that the running backs are an 8.4, that sounds like that's like a B level grade. But then if you were to hear that the linebackers were a 6.2, you'd be like, that sounds like a D. That sounds like a really bad, like, right. That's like if you were to convert these to percentages, if you got a 62% in the class, that's like a D grade. If you got like an 84% in the class, that's like a solid B grade. So there is a big difference here that I just don't know if I've done a very good job of capturing with the actual letter grades itself, which, as Matt points out, for those listening who haven't read the story, I'll just run through the letter grades now that I did the order part, which maybe was out of order, but I thought provided just kind of interesting context to start with. For the overall team grade, I gave the team a B. For the offensive grade, I gave the team a B+. Sorry, my file just quit as I was reading through it, so I'm a little bit out of sorts here. Okay.
Good timing.
Great timing. Quarterback, I gave a B+. Running back was a B+. Wide receivers, B+. Offensive line group plus. The entire offense got B+ across the board. As I said earlier, the scores were very, very close. Like, I included here. My file's back. That's great. From an actual like average score perspective, like here's what it ended up with. Running back was 8.4. Offensive line 8.3. Quarterbacks off 8.2. Receivers 7.9. So they're all kind of grouped together. Then you go to defense. I gave their overall defensive grade a B, which is, again, a 6.7 grade. So that B is, in this case, equivalent. Again, this is probably not the great system. A 6.7 for the defense is equivalent to a B grade, which is the same grade I gave for a 7.2 for the overall team. So there's a pretty big disparity.
Very nice
there.
of you.
Yeah, I know.
Feels like we're taking like a physics class where they're just like, 50% you guys passed. Don't worry about it. You're in.
I think the letter grades are off.
I think, I would, judging by that, I would just go with what the decimal point is. So the defense is 6.7 is a D+.
I think that's kind of what I might do next year. So here I'll run through the rest of it. Defensive line is a B, but that's a 6.9 B. Linebacker was a B-, but a 6.2. And defensive back was a B at a 6.85, so very close to D-line. And then special teams was a B at 7.2. So also not a very good grade, but ends up seeing a little stronger.
D+ and a C.
I think if that's what the grades look like, and I think that maybe if that's the case, that feels a little bit harsh because I think there's some good players that played well this season. Like, again,
there were some good games too,
right?
Against Utah, like Oregon's defense was really good, but
and that's the thing that's hard in these grades is that the season grades these aren't done. Like, these are done in individual vacuums. I was going to say they aren't done in a vacuum because, like, it's not like I'm coming at the end of the season being like, all right, let's look at all the data from like an outside perspective. I am literally going, well, in Atlanta, I thought the defense was an F, but when I came home against Eastern Washington, I gave them this, and you go all the way down the list. So they're like, it's built into what I thought in the moment, which I think is a value. So it's not like the emotion of the game maybe plays a role, but it's not like the emotion of the season plays a role because it's all kind of independent data points, which I like. But it's I do think I'm going to kind of recapture and reconsider how I kind of evaluate post-season. But I do think what you end up with, at least, is an understanding that they're, from my perspective, and I think most people who watch this team on a week-to-week basis, I think the offense performed really well. I don't think there's any question about that. I have a bunch of data here in the story if you want to go look at it. The story, by the way, for those listening who haven't read it, is much more than just letter grades. Like, I gave about 200-word explanations for each grade on the site, so there's quite a bit of data to look through, but like some information for the offense here. this is the most points, the most yards, and the most points per play by any Oregon offense since 2015. The Ducks scored more than 40 points 8 straight weeks, gained over 430 yards in each of those weeks, averaged over 500 yards, and finished above 500 yards in 7 of 13 games. So the offense was fantastic. I thought the grades there were probably pretty reasonable. B+, you probably could argue maybe there's an A- or something there for a position group if you wanted to get generous. And then defensively, it was just not good. And I think we all kind of know why. Some of the data points I hit at the bottom here were obviously there's the yards given up, but they were 124th out of 131 teams on third down. They were 115th out of 131 teams with sacks. Those 2 data points to me, I think we might have touched some of those. We did a season stat review where each of us picked some
there
stats.
Goes Matt.
Oh, Matt's gone. Well, he'll be back.
It's us 2 for now.
But my point is, I think like you can easily understand sort of the way the grades encapsulate the season. There's probably some argument in terms of what the grades themselves are.
I think I have here's something. I think you're too low on the offense.
Yeah, I could be convinced that way.
I think a B+ letter grade, while good, is a little too low. Just because outside of the Georgia game, they were fantastic, especially with the healthy Bo Nix.
So here's what happened on the grades. I'm going to just run through the grades week by week from offense perspective.
Sure.
And once we get Matt back, we can maybe pivot. I'm not sure the audience is all that interested in my grades. That's just the way it works. This is podcasting. We'll kind of live and learn. Back half of this pod is going to be answering questions you might have about other things that aren't grade related. If you have grade questions, I'm excited to talk about it.
The teacher is here, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah,
they can answer.
So here's how the offense grade just played week 1 through 13. I got a D against Georgia. This is offense.
Mm-hmm.
A, B+, B, A+, B, A-, B+, B. B was against Utah, and that was obviously just a really tough game. Bo was in and out of injury. C+ against Oregon State. I was a game where the stats were okay, but the way that they just couldn't finish it at the end was tough. And then a B against North Carolina, where they had a really tough middle of the game finish strong. So the back end of the season here, if you were to remove the last 4 games, which of course you can't, where they got a B+, a B, a C+, and a B, you'd be looking at your A- kind of grade probably. You'd be looking at a significantly better grade. But the basically 4 of the worst 5 weeks were to close the season, unfortunately. And I'll also say one other thought, Jared. Sorry, because I noticed a grade here that's probably really unfair if you look at the stats from the game. Some of this is like kind of based upon the perception the team gives after the game. Like I think the Cal game is a really good example of that. The Cal offense, do you remember that game? Oregon scored a ton of points, had a lot of yards, but they had a couple of red zone deficiencies. And we got down to the press conference, and Dan and Bo and Alex Forsyth were all like, we just didn't do it today. It wasn't a very good day. But if you were to look at the numbers, I bet you that's probably an A grade, but I gave it a B in part because the players were like, meh, we didn't play very well. And I was like, all right, well, the players didn't think they played well. So I'll say they didn't play well.
Yeah, I just I don't know, man. I feel like that, especially like the B grade against North Carolina, the C+ grade against Oregon State. If I didn't tell you how they lost those, or how they lost the Oregon State game, if I didn't tell you how they won the UNC game, if we went back in time and talked to an Oregon fan last year with the Mario Cristobal-led offense and said that, hey, this offense is going to put up this amount of yards, this amount of points, this amount of throwing yards, this amount of rushing yards, and you guys will either win or lose, I think everybody would give that an A. I think this offense was just remarkable all season long. And let's not forget that Kenny Dillingham wasn't in that Holiday Bowl, and Kenny Dillingham was out the door on his way to Arizona State for that Oregon State game as well. I just think, and this is nitpicking, I think overall a B+ is more than a fine grade for this offense. I just think it could be even higher. I think you could go A-. I think you could, if this guy, if the offense were to drop an apple at your desk, I think that you would easily be convinced that it could be an A- or an A team. I just think it was just comparatively from season to season and the offensive statistics, and how well they played and what the formation was and all that good stuff and how they got everybody involved, the emergence of Troy Franklin, Bucky Irving, blah, blah, blah. I just think it was an A- kind of team, especially on offense. Now, defense, as we went over, might have a little tinkering to your grading system overall, but again, I think it was more than fair. It's tough to be so dismissive of the defense and just give everybody like a D plus, just because
Well,
they weren't.
They weren't.
I know that they were
bad.
poor.
They weren't bad. They weren't as bad as some people want to represent.
No, they just. We're not saying that they were good.
No,
don't get me wrong. No,
because I've been very clear on the offseason. They have a lot of work to do. There's some positions that really need to be hit and retooled, and I think we're in total agreement there. I just think, like, playing defense is really difficult in modern college football, especially with the caliber of quarterback play that Oregon played. Like, you think about the quarterbacks that they played over the course of the season. I won't say they played the most difficult group of quarterbacks in the country, because that would be very much hyperbolic. But like, they played.
It was really good.
There are 4 or 5 guys here that are going to probably have an opportunity to start at some point in the NFL. Like, I mean, at least 2 or 3, right?
At least 2 or 3.
Maybe 4 or 5 might be too much. They didn't play Caleb Williams. I think in my head I had that they had.
And Caleb Williams is going to be a number 1 overall pick, most likely.
Unfortunately, he wasn't on the schedule. But I was in my, just like they played some really high-end quarterbacks in this conference this year. They played, obviously, to start the season, 2 pretty darn good quarterbacks. So they played some good teams. So it can be a difficult, I think it's difficult here because the defense certainly is not good, and I'm not going to say they are, and the results were disappointing. But I think you look across the country, and of course, Oregon stats aren't there with everybody else. But like, I don't think this is like the worst defense Oregon has had like in a decade. I'm not going to say anything hyperbolic.
No, 2016.
2016 was it?
It's that simple.
But there were some really clear weaknesses, but I think there were enough strengths that I kind of think like, yeah, okay, like maybe it should be a C plus grade, not a B minus grade for these. But like, I don't think they were devastatingly terrible either.
No, and this is going to be an extremely poor comparison, and I know this going into it, but I'm still going to say it. Like, everybody wants Oregon's defense to only allow like 25 points a game and be nationally ranked. It kind of be like what that 2019 defense was. Oregon just doesn't have the secondary. And to your point, Eric, how good offenses are now in college football. The college football playoff game, everybody scored over 40 points. Now, so there was basically no defense being played. And this is from, your top 4 teams in the country. And I know that TCU doesn't have a great defensive resume, but Ohio State, Georgia, Michigan, all those guys were top 15 in defense overall in this past season, especially Michigan and Georgia. And those guys, especially Michigan, those guys got boat raced. It just wasn't, you just had to score if you were going to win that game. And eventually somebody did score, and that was Georgia and that was TCU, but there was no defense being played there. There was a turnover every once in a while. I think Max Duggan threw 2 interceptions, but still, TCU at one point was averaging over like 7.5 yards a play. Like, there's no defense going on. So as poor as Oregon's defense was, I just think it's really difficult to play like, to your credit, or to your point, excuse me. Like, I think it's just difficult to play defense. However, those are the college football playoffs against the best offenses in the country as well as the best defense in the country. So you would like Oregon to play well defensively when they play against Cal, where there were points where you're like, oh man, the Cal's backup quarterback is in and he's having a good day at the office. And that's just really not something that you want to see. Or how Colorado kind of moved the ball briefly down the field. Just Oregon should do much better against inferior competition. They shouldn't be pushed around like they were at Oregon State. And I'm not saying that Oregon State's inferior competition, but when you're up by that many, you shouldn't be pushed around like that. That game shouldn't have been close. That game shouldn't have been a loss type of deal. So defensively, like we've been talking about a while on this podcast, they need a lot of help, and seemingly getting it in the recruiting cycle.
All right, programming note here. Matt Prehm's internet is kaput. He is having issues yesterday. I think there's an outage over in his neck of the woods. He just messaged us on Slack, our messaging service, that he will not be able to rejoin the live stream. So it's just, you're going to be stuck with Jared and I for the rest of this. We're going to do about probably 25, 30 more minutes, depending on questions here. If you do have questions, please submit them. There's a couple here we can get to. I think that kind of wraps it up for my grades. I will go ahead and maybe I did this out of order. Maybe I should have done this sooner. I'm going to throw my grade story into the live stream chat. So if you did want to read the story, you can read it now. And I guess if you have follow-up questions, you can. As I should probably tossed it in there just to start the stream so people knew what we were talking. talking about, but you live, you learn, you get better. Hopefully it goes better next time. First question we're going to get to, should we do a break right now, Jared? Do you think Matt would like it if we did a break?
Yeah.
I think
let's do a break.
In the honor of Matt Prehm, who is no longer with us on this podcast, we will take a quick break and be right back. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles Podcast. Jared is laughing because it sounded like I was giving that.
in memoriam. Yeah.
In memoriam of Matt Prehm have his birth year up on the screen here. If we were better with the service here, we could have pulled off a funny joke there, but we do not, and probably not equipped anyway. First question we're going to hit here comes from Nosy5. And again, for those that are listening after the stream, we are going to be reading questions from the stream. If you want to be on future streams, we have about 50 people in here right now this morning. We will send out links, and I think the expectation is Friday mornings. If you want to be a part, probably in the 9 o'clock hour will be, I think, the consistent time period. So from Nosy5, Matt,
is he back?
Yeah. Oh. We just did an in memoriam from
We're
you.
Back. Yeah.
We just wrote you off.
I may be gone in 5 seconds. Who knows?
All right.
We are just wrapping up the grades, and we're going to answer some questions. So I was about to read a question from Nosy5. Matt is he is with us, guys. He has rose from the dead. This is very exciting.
Yeah. The internet in my area got knocked out last night by the storms, so I've been fighting bad updates from Comcast all night into this morning.
Okay, so Matt's back.
If I disappear, that's where I go.
He's gone into the internet ether. From Nosy5, who do you think is the next to commit? Don't you think it's more likely it's a portal guy, probably?
Yes.
Yeah.
Evan Williams is the first name that popped in my head.
Same here.
Mm-hmm. All right, next question.
I mean, even if it's not Evan Williams, it could be another guy too. I mean, I think you have to look strongly at Jordan Birch from South Carolina. The former 5-star player, Dan Lanning, was his primary recruiter at Georgia. Mm-hmm. Our South Carolina side's even saying, like, they're hearing Oregon is, like, in the driver's seat. We haven't heard driver's seat, but we know there's interest. That would be the next one. So I don't – let me ask you this question. Like, would you be surprised if they didn't add a single high school guy moving forward? Because, like, Deuce Robinson seems unreal, like, possible, but not likely.
Not as good as it did before, maybe.
Harbor, maybe. I mean, the 5-star athlete, dual sport track star, and also football player. But even then, that kind of feels like Oregon came in really late. There may be just a new name that's generating a bunch of buzz, but we'll see. Roderick Pleasant feels like he's going to go to USC. Tamari Johnson is going to probably stick with Louisville, which I think is a sign that room is tight for Oregon. I kind of think they may not sign a single guy high school-wise. There's not a lot of names out there.
No, and you've kind of run through them, and strangely, Harbor is the one you probably have the most confidence in right now.
Yeah.
And he hasn't even visited, and Oregon basically was in on his recruitment like 3 weeks ago. Was like they weren't even a factor before he signed. He chose not to sign. Yeah, I probably agree that I think it's definitely a portal guy. And for those listening who maybe haven't done the background on Evan Williams, that's Bennett Williams' younger brother, played at Fresno State, also a big-time safety. I think there's our Fresno State insider who is also our Cal, Stanford, Hawaii, San Jose State. Probably another one, Jackson Moore. He's been on this podcast like a number of times. Yeah. Has posted on our message board that he's heard from Fresno State sources that Evan Williams is very much likely to go to Oregon, which is why, like Matt, that would also be where I would start. And it'd be interesting to see if they aren't as active with the preps, because from a numbers perspective, this is already the biggest class in school history, right? This is more signings they've ever had. They're close to 30.
There's a million.
Gee, they really need more. And personally, I probably at this point, unless it is a Harbor or a Robinson who's a 5-star who in theory could make an impact sooner than later, probably feel pretty comfortable that you've got plenty of developmental players set to be on your 23 roster. So let's go find a couple of guys who can be plug and plays, which is, I've said several times in the pod, is what your goal is in the portal. And both the guys Matt talked about, Williams and Birch, certainly qualify for me.
Yeah, it has to be a portal guy. I don't like Matt just went through the names. I think those are the really only likely candidates left. I don't think Oregon would necessarily look to add like a 3-star depth guy at cornerback or something. I think it's going to go portal or nothing. Evan Williams, like you guys have mentioned, I know he's a Fresno State guy, so maybe people don't think that he's as talented because it's Fresno State and he was a 3-star recruit. Evan Williams is really good. He made second team All Mountain West this year after missing a couple of games due to a knee injury. I think it was a knee injury. And then he made All Mountain West first team last season in 2021 against Oregon when Fresno State played them in 2021. He had 12 tackles and 1 pass deflection. He really opened some eyes in that game. He's very talented. He would be a welcome addition to the safety room.
Yeah.
I mean, the safeties, especially considering that 4 of the 6 scholarship safeties can leave after this season, or they can leave now, I guess.
Right.
With Jamal Hill, Brian Addison, Steve Stevens, and then Bennett Williams is already gone. He's out of eligibility. Those other 3 can make the option to leave. So I think that's a huge addition if he does make the decision to come to Oregon. We've all been hearing good things about that. And Jordan Birch, yeah, I mean, like Matt said, Dan Lanning was his primary recruiter when he was defensive coordinator at Georgia. Is a former 5-star commit. This is a former top 10 player in the country. Same class as Justin Flo and Noah Sewell, that class of 2020. Yep. He was 8th in the 24/7 Sports Composite, 17th in the top 247, so a consensus 5-star recruit. He was the number 2 defensive tackle in the country, behind Brian Brzee out of Clemson, who's going to be a first-round pick. Look, like if you go look at Birch's statistics, you might find them to be underwhelming, and they are. They're underwhelming. There isn't anybody on the West Coast who plays Pacific Conference football, Pac-12 football, who has the same body type as Jordan Birch. He is an anomaly out here. He's a faster, bigger, better, stronger version of DJ Johnson, who was Oregon's best pass rusher this past season, who is a similar physique, but Birch is even bigger. If Oregon lands him, I think he will be quite productive at Oregon compared to playing in the SEC at South Carolina.
The numbers aren't awful though this year.
No, they're not awful. But with the 5-star buzz that he had coming in, he's South Carolina's highest rated recruit of all time. He's from South Carolina. He picked South Carolina over Clemson, which, quick sidebar, if Clemson got Jordan Birch, Brian Brzee, and Miles Murphy in the same recruiting class, that would have been crazy. But back to the conversation. The numbers aren't bad. He still was credited for 40 pressures on PFF.
Yeah. So counting stats, 60 tackles, I think 7.5 tackles for loss, 3 or 3.5 sacks. Yeah. So like that's solid. But as you said, Jared, when you say the expectation is 5-star local kid, people are expecting the moon and the stars or whatever from him. And he doesn't get there right away. And then he leaves. I understand why that's probably really disappointing for South Carolina fans. I think if you're an Oregon fan and this does come together, which again hasn't officially happened clearly, this would be really significant. These are the type of SEC athletes that Dan Lanning needs to bring to Oregon, and kind of like the sales pitch when he was brought in to a certain degree was these are the type of guys he would be bringing to Oregon, right? Like this is kind of following through on, hey, we're going to provide an SEC caliber defense. Well, year 1 certainly wasn't that. Year 2, I think it's probably a stretch that it looks anywhere near as good as it could, but you bring in players like this and you start turning the corner maybe to get there. All right, I got another question. Matt, did you have one?
I was just going to pose, like a couple days ago, Cal's star freshman receiver, J. Michael Sturdivant, put his name in the portal. Receiver isn't, I don't feel like, the biggest need, but that would be a talent that I would go after. Really productive in the Pac-12, 755 yards. He had 7 touchdown passes. And against Oregon and Washington, he went 14 catches for 175 and 3 touchdowns over those 2 games, his best 2-game stretch. I feel like that would be an ad that, while not a need, would be worth going after. Just he's like 6'4" too. Not a body type Oregon has a lot of on the roster right now.
If he wants to come to Oregon, you can't say no to that.
Yes.
No, and I guess my thought is,
I think it's they don't need him though.
Yeah, he probably doesn't start this year because he's probably a Z. Maybe he pushes Holden, but he could be a player that you bring in and you develop, and by 2024, he's arguably he's like your best receiver, your second best receiver. Because Franklin, I think there's a legitimate chance Franklin's going to be 3 and done. Like I wouldn't be surprised if next year's his last year. Not to set that expectation as being what it should, like it has to be that, but he's proven through 2 years to be a really high end player. This last year, that was really impressive. And then Holden's correct me if I'm wrong, I think he's just a 1-year eligibility and he's done guy, right? Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
So your X and your Z, you could pitch some big time portal guy like a Sturdivant that, hey, come here for a year. You can be our third outside receiver, maybe our fourth outside receiver, push for playing time. But the next year, both those spots are opening up and you're competing with, Jurian Dickey, who's a 5-star, and some other players. Maybe we'll hit the portal again. But like there's a pitch to be made that like, hey, by 2024, if you want to be patient, like you could be the top receiver on a really good team on the West Coast. But I like the name, Matt. When I saw that name jump in too, I was like, I wonder if there'll be any interest there, just because he did have such a good game.
I think a lot of people are going to have interest in him. I mean, he's from Texas. It wouldn't surprise me if he goes back home.
All right. From LFBP Fishing. Hi, guys. What game or games are you most excited for and why? I assume we're talking next season, which makes sense because we're kind of finished with this year, transitioning to next. Schedule's not out. We know who they will be playing. We don't have order of operations or like game days or times or any of that. 2 that just jump off the top of my head. Texas Tech will be fun. I've never been down to that part of Texas. I've been to Texas twice. One was for the football game in 2019, the Oregon-Auburn game. That'll be fun, not to mention the fact that Tyler Shuck maybe get a little bit of a revenge tour, goes against his former school. Things didn't end great here. Of course, next to nobody that he played with or coached him
is on the team.
Is on the team. So it's not like he's got like people back in Eugene. He's like, oh, I really don't like. I'm sure he probably has good relationships with almost anybody who's still around. Tyler was one of my favorite people to cover. I thought really highly of him as a person, especially through a really tough year where he was trying to be the quarterback during a COVID year, all of that. That'll be kind of fun to see. Be fun to see Tyler Chuck versus the Ducks. I'm not sure if that's the first game of the year, but it's one of the first. And then the USC coming to Autzen one last time game is probably everyone's top pick, I would imagine. And we don't have a date on that, but like this is their last year in the conference. Oregon and USC's, I would say, rivalry, although they haven't really faced each other too often on the field of late. Like those are 2 schools that really don't like each other. They recruit against each other all the time, and one has really kind of done the conference a little dirty with the way that all played out. You can argue, you could say you understand why in terms of the financials. There's that, but still, like at the end of the day, USC has kind of dealt a death blow to the Pac-12, and I don't think everybody on the West Coast is very happy about that. And their last opportunity for Oregon to play them at home will be next season. So I think those are the easy ones for me.
I think those are like the only options other than finishing on the road at Utah and at Seattle with Washington. I think that those are more tough games than anything else. Something to watch on the schedule. But yeah, I mean, going to Lubbock will be something. My cousins went to Texas Tech, so I know about Lubbock. I've never been to Lubbock, but I know that there's not a lot out there. So that'll be fun. Texas Tech, I've heard, is a great football environment, so I think that'll just be fun in general. A nice Big 12 road game, and then against USC, against Caleb Williams, and 2022 Heisman Trophy winner, and it would be interesting to see how USC looks during this offseason. Got really exposed against Tulane in that dramatic upset. I would call that an upset for sure.
They were favored.
They were favored, so it'll be interesting just to see what that whole team looks like by the time Oregon and USC meet on the football field. But besides that game is in Eugene, it's just not a great schedule for next year. It's just not, like compared to this year and the home games that Oregon got. It's just not as favorable.
I disagree. Are you talking just marquee names, or are you talking order? Because we don't know the order yet.
No, I'm just talking marquee names. Like you had much better names coming to Oregon this past season.
Well, I think we get Deion Sanders in Eugene.
That'll
Colorado.
be interesting.
That'll be interesting. We get Caleb Williams and USC their last trip here in Eugene. And we also get Oregon State, which that game is going to have some hostility to it. I guarantee it on January 6th. I think, yes, the non-con kind of sucks, Portland State and Hawaii. Not good. But the Cal is Cal. But Washington State could be interesting. That's always fun. But
at Washington.
Yeah. I was going to ask,
that's going to be something, man.
If we put our hats on and we're Pac-12 schedulers from a marketing standpoint,
okay.
Typically, Oregon plays Washington most times in like early November. Does Oregon and they always for whatever reason have been playing Utah the second to last week of the regular season? I think that's been the case like 3 or 4 years in a row now, excluding COVID. Do you swap USC for one of those 2 games, or do you want to play USC Oregon in Autzen in like early October, late September, and hope that both teams are still in that top 5, or not top 5, like top 15-ish ranking perspective next season? USC may be top 5. Oregon will probably be closer to 12 or 13, but
yeah.
Or do you bank on both teams being really, really good and you second to last game of the year and you hope for a top 5 matchup?
I kind of want to see that game played in good weather.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Just because of the way the 2 teams are composed, I just want to see 1,000,000 points scored. So if I'm thinking not just competition-wise, but aesthetically, play that game like maybe your second or third Pac-12 game in, like the second weekend of October or something would be kind of an interesting time for that game to be played. Because I actually, in general, I know they didn't quite do it this year. They played Utah as their second to last Pac-12 game. Obviously, that was a tough schedule to close the year. I kind of like it where you're playing Washington and Oregon State, almost just like if it was just a set ruling that those were your last 2 games of every Pac-12 season. I don't know if they would. I mean, Oregon State has always been the last Pac-12 game, but like scheduling Washington the weekend before that could be kind of a fun regular way to close the season. Like it'd be really challenging because those are 2 teams that seem like they're on the rise along with Oregon, but just to finish the season with your 2 rivals, like kind of seems like the way it should be, because it's like Oregon is different than other teams in this conference where you've got your local regional rival with an Oregon State, but Oregon and Washington are bigger rivals than Oregon and Oregon State, at least from the Oregon perspective. Like Oregon really doesn't like Washington. So playing those 2 teams back to back or close to, I kind of like the way the schedule played out this year where it was Washington, Utah, Oregon State. So I'd love to have Washington scheduled every year in, the first or second weekend of November, and then you play Oregon State to wrap it. I think that should be the way this game is scheduled. Play your 1 or 2 marquee games against the Pac-12 South at some point in the month of October. Maybe give yourself a bye week after the big marquee game. Like if you were just to schedule this out, I don't know if we want to do this all the way, but like play your non-conference. Oregon plays one of the weaker teams in its first conference game. Like if I was scheduling, this is what I would do. Then you play your USC, or maybe you put another one in before it. And then after the USC game, you do your bye. Maybe you come back with a decent team, and then you finish it with your run we talked about where it's like Washington, Oregon State to close. That would be how, if I was in the scheduling office, that would be my way of doing it, I think.
I think that's a good way of doing it. I would say just a quick thing about USC. They played, I don't know if it's any logical explanation of what they would do next year, but they played Oregon State on September 24th. So earlier in the season. I agree with you. I think it should be earlier in the season. I don't know what USC's non-conference is off the top of my head, so I'll keep looking at that right now while I filibuster into that situation. But they play San Jose State, Nevada, and that's it. They play San Jose State and Nevada, and then Notre Dame.
Notre Dame is there. Right. They do that every year.
It's not. So I don't know. Maybe they could do an Oregon week and then break and then Notre Dame for USC. But I think it should be played earlier in the season. And I would like to see Oregon's regular season end with their two biggest rivals in Washington and then Oregon State. I think Oregon might be nuts and bolts and kind of screwed here with how many of tough away games. It would not be great if they had basically the same schedule as they did this year, just with back-to-back away games against Washington and Utah. But we'll see. Hopefully the schedule comes out. It's so late this year.
It's supposed to be sometime before March, which is
that's so arbitrary. That's 90
so it's like
days.
Sometimes in the next 90 days. Like, all right,
sometimes before September 3rd.
Yeah. One final comment. Sneaky game at Arizona State. Kenny Dillingham versus Dan Lanning. I hope that game's in late October. Give me Arizona weather in late October. I'm okay missing Arizona in September when it's still balls hot, but when it's like 56
it's going to be September 24th.
Yeah, it's going to be a stupid night game.
Oh God, I hope that's not what it is. I'm with you, Matt. That'd be fun to play that one. Maybe that's your game coming out of that bye week. Okay, I'm scripting it. You got USC bye week, Arizona State on the road. That seems pretty. That seems fitting. Pac-12 schedules, make it happen. Let's move on to another question. Unless one of you guys have one queued up, I have one chosen here from Marcus Phoenix 503. What do you guys think the wide receiver rotation will be next year? And by the way, what are we thinking? Probably 20 more minutes of question answering, and then we'll hop off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thereabouts.
Matt, you'd be proud of us, by the way. We did a break. We did a commercial break.
Terrific.
In your honor, in memoriam of Matt.
A moment of silence.
Yeah, we did a moment of silence for you. So back to Marcus's question. I think we've talked about this a little bit, so maybe we'll keep this question quick and move on. But I think you've got Troy, obviously, as your starting X receiver, and no one's going to take him off that. That's his job. That's his role. He's going to carry it again. He was fantastic. He and Bo have a great chemistry. I think Trayshawn Holden at Z makes a lot of sense. They lost their top two Z guys. That's the other outside receiver with Chase and Dante Thornton hitting the portal. So you've got an open spot. You bring in a guy from Alabama who was their starting Z. Adds up. Makes sense. And then I am kind of leaning, the more we had our conversation on our last podcast or one of the ones recently, I can't remember. I think Tez Johnson might be the starting slot. I'm kind of being convinced of that. Chris Hudson comes back having started every game last year. Maybe I'm buying too much into the PFF hype, into the relationship with his adopted brother, who's the quarterback. But it makes quite a bit of sense to me. He's a more productive player than what Chris Hudson has been. And as we've established before, like PFF thinks he's like a super elite guy. He was the second best receiver in the country. So I'll go with that as the starting three. After that, it gets kind of tough. If Chris Hudson, assuming he's still on the team, like clearly he's your backup slot and probably technically your backup X and Z too, in terms of like, I would imagine they would, if he's going to stick around, try to incorporate him in the offense in a lot of different ways, assuming he doesn't win the job, as I've hypothetically said he won't. I would put Jurian Dickey at probably, he seems like a Z to me, but we'll see what happens. So I would put him there, and then I'd have Kyler Casper at X because I know that's where he was working last year. So that would be my three backups would be Casper, Hudson, Dickey, and I feel pretty decent about that in early January. That makes a lot of sense. That would be the order, and you could convince me that Hudson is above Johnson just because the guy's proven it in terms of playing at Oregon and having started. But I don't know. I really like everything I've seen and heard and read about Tez Johnson makes me think he could be somebody who could have a sizable role and probably push to start right away.
Yeah, I don't have anything else. That's what I would do. Just depends on if Hudson stays and we're not reporting anything that he's thinking about leaving or anything like that. It's just when you bring in a guy who's established at your own position group, sometimes guys leave. But Dickey is Eric. You think he's more of a Z than an X?
Yeah, that's how I look at. I don't know in terms of just the body type, but it could go either way. I don't know. We'll see when he gets here.
I feel like he could play either. I guess Kozar would be a more X receiver than Dickey. Because he's a bit taller. He's got more just straight line speed.
Yeah, Z's are. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
I don't know either. We'll ask Junior Adams, and then he'll maybe explain it to us. Probably not, but we'll just take random shots in the dark during our depth chart prediction, which should be going live in 2 weeks here.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that they might need to add one other guy, just as maybe another established veteran person. Again, I brought this up before, but the Caleb Chapman type, where it's a low risk, high reward fella, just again to get more experience back there and not rely so heavily on potentially Kyler Casper or Jurion Dickey, even though I think both could step up to that moment. I think the rotation is good. I think probably you would have liked to added one more really big impact guy, just to line an important Z receiver up next to Troy Franklin. But I think Trayshawn Holden can be something like that. I think he can be really effective in the Pac-12 and really effective in Will Stein's offense.
It's kind of why I was bringing up Strudevant from Cal. Like, I think he could play in that role that Jared's talking about. To the original question, I think the only thing I would change is I would keep Hudson as the projected starter. He's been a 2-year starter at Oregon, and he was fairly productive this season. I know Tez was very productive, but new system, higher level of competition. I think you have to factor that in. And it would be one in which I hate the or, but I would probably include the or. But I would just give the nod to Chris because he is an established player. He is an established starter. And he's not been terrible. Like I would bank on the experience within the system before giving a newcomer the job right away. Not saying he can't lose it because I agree with you. Like he could lose that job. Like Tez could beat him out in spring ball and get the job if Tez is here for the spring, or he could beat him out in fall camp. But going in, it's Hudson's job to lose.
It's going to be, I think, one of the more interesting offensive position battles in my mind going into the season, because you've got quarterback, you know what that is. You've got running back, you know what that is. There's maybe some backup tight end competition depending on what happens with McCormick and Sadiq. Sadiq joins the fray. And then there's a couple offensive line positions, but I think the most pronounced one could be the slot receiver in terms of we just could go either way. They're going to have two very high caliber players there. Hudson was a pretty highly rated recruit who has had some moments, and Tez Johnson has been very productive at Troy. Really impressive on tape in terms of just the explosiveness there. Do you guys have any questions that you've seen in the chat that jump out, or I've got another one if you want to throw it there.
I saw one from Ronald Reagan asking what position does Birch play from South Carolina. He plays edge, defensive line edge. So
Ronald Reagan's in the chat.
Yeah, Ronald joined the chat. His profile picture is a dog, so I appreciate you, Ronald, for coming back and joining our football chat here.
I think Birch. I think Birch could play the DJ Johnson standing role, or in a pinch, the same role Brennan Dorless played as the weak side defensive end. Is kind of I think he could play either one based on his body type and what he's done. I have another Ronald Reagan question. Do you want to roll with it? Do you want to just keep
go for it? Yeah.
Former presidents are getting getting special privileges on this podcast. From Ronald Reagan. Why would Oregon even think about leaving the Pac-12 when they are likely in the running for a playoff every year? I mean, the short and long of it is money, is the financial disparity between what the Big Ten television contract is going to be and what the Pac-12's contract is projected to be, in which you're talking about $50-60 million per year for member schools potentially in terms of the difference between the two. That's all it is. There's no And that's the only reason USC left, if we're just being honest about it. It doesn't make sense from a regional perspective, from a travel perspective, from a history of rivalry perspective. In Oregon's case, I also don't know if it may. I mean, in terms of making a college football playoff run, it makes less sense to be in the Big Ten than the Pac-12, I would argue. But the financials of it also make it to which I think you have a very compelling case, and one I probably would follow through with, of saying, you don't want to be in a spot where you're making significantly less money year over year than teams you're recruiting against, right? With USC and UCLA in the Big Ten, and you're now going head to head. Oregon's winning those recruiting battles right now at a pretty high rate. I know UCLA just took Dante Moore. USC obviously got some wins this year, but Oregon is still big dog on the West Coast from a recruiting rankings perspective. Was this 4 straight years? Is that right? That's pretty darn impressive. Mm-hmm. Pulling that off 5, says Matt. 5 straight years. I think, yeah, you're right. 5 straight years. Pulling that off year over year consistently becomes a little more difficult when USC and UCLA have a lot more resources to deal with than what Oregon would. So that's the argument for Oregon leaving the conference is a financial one. There's no argument from a competitive balance perspective, from a geography/travel budget. Like all the staying in the Pac-12 makes sense from a competitive perspective, but the issue becomes, does the conference remain viable if they're sucked clean of all their financial capital compared to what the Big Ten is making, what the SEC is projected to make, all of this stuff. The financial numbers are not positive. So that's the reason, Ronald.
Yeah, that's the sole reason. It's just money, and I think competitively, I have a different take where it would benefit Oregon from joining one of these super conferences before it gets too late in terms of competition. Just because you look at a team like Ohio State, who does lose to Michigan, who happens to be a top 5 team in the country. There's more top 5 teams in the country in the SEC and the Big Ten, more likely than not, at the time when you lose and during the middle of the season. So I feel better about if Oregon joined the Pac-12 for both competitive reasons and monetary values. I just think it's the right way to go. I've been saying this since the summer, since the news officially announced that USC and UCLA were going. So I don't know. I'm still all on board if Oregon can somehow squeak their way into the Big Ten. It's an absolute must. We don't know what the Pac-12 TV deal will be, who it'll be streaming on, how much money it'll be for. The Big Ten just got theirs done. The Big 12 just got theirs done. I don't know. I don't know what TV value or TV market is really going to want the Pac-12 without USC and UCLA. It's just not as good of a product. It just isn't. And then the TV viewership market without the LA market around it, it's just not as valuable of a product as it is with the Big 10 or even the Big 12.
And Rutgers is pulling in $90 million a year from the Big Ten's media deal.
Hell yeah.
And a program like Oregon, who is in a different stratosphere of a program as Rutgers.
Hey, you take it easy on Greg Schiano. Easy.
Is making roughly $32 million a year.
Right. It becomes too much.
Yeah.
Astronomical.
Like that is the issue. Is competitively, like Erik said, like they're there. Like the Pac-12 and without USC and UCLA, it's what you want because you become the Clemson of the ACC, but a Pac-12 version where you're so much better than everybody else from a talent perspective. And as long as you do your job, you're going to be 11-1, 12-0 going into your conference championship game. The playoffs are in the picture every single year. But when there's a 30, 40, 50 million, $60 million difference between you and a team that can't get to a bowl game, you can't sustain that. You can't stay alive for the longevity of the sport and with that difference of payout.
And what the long-term issue becomes is the Pac-12 is not recruiting on the same level right now anyway with the Big Ten and the SEC. Yeah. They're better than the Big 12 for the most part, pretty comparable. But they're not recruiting at that level to begin with. And when you zap the financial resources, you give a bunch of money then to USC and UCLA. Those two schools would, in theory, this would be the plan for the Big Ten, I guess. They would just kick ass on the recruiting show on the West Coast, go pull out all the top players, opens the door again for more other schools, from outside the region, the Ohio States and all these Big Ten SEC members to come and raid your area. And Oregon, while maybe financially in better situation because of some big donors up the road in the Portland area, could kind of hold serve for a little bit. It's just not really tenable to ask Phil Knight to give excessive numbers, every single year to try to stay competitive. So, this is where it is. I don't know. I don't think in year 1, 2, 3, or 4, you're going to feel. I think the first 4 years where USC and UCLA are outside the conference, I think the Pac-12 and some of the member schools can kind of stay afloat and feel pretty good. There's good talent on these teams. We saw this year the Pac-12 was, I think, one of the better seasons it's had in quite some time. I think the 2023 season could be very strong as well. But you get into an issue here where the talent will over a period of 5-6 years just start to evaporate on the West Coast, and most of the best players will play probably at USC, UCLA based upon the financial parts and all of that. So no, that's the concern. It's a financial concern, and I get it, and I would prefer that they were in the Big Ten, but we'll see if that becomes how viable that option becomes. Time for a couple more. Or are we good?
You got anyone that you want to do?
I got one here.
Let's do one more.
Okay. Well, then let me be selective here. There's a couple in here. We've got some people clowning on Ronald Reagan's name here, which is always appreciated. Okay, here's a basic one. I'll kind of toss this over to Matt. From Dan Johnson, any update on a new safeties coach? Matt Powledge has taken off for Baylor. We talked about this a while ago. Been a little bit quiet on that front, I feel like, since. Matt, do you have any updates or any kind of sense of where that's headed?
Yeah, I mean, the expectation is this gets done here in the next week or so, maybe 2. The National Coaches Convention, I believe, kicks off tomorrow. Maybe it's tonight. That's back east, though.
Yeah, I think it's tonight.
It typically runs right around the time frame of the national championship game, and this is where a lot of hires start. It's a networking event for coaches. It's also a place to conduct interviews with a lot of people very quickly because for the most part, most coaches go to this, whether you're looking for a job or whether you're just trying to network or learn some new tricks to the trade, whatever. This is a big period of time where deals start the process. So it wouldn't be surprising here if in the next 10 days something happens. It has been really quiet though, Eric. You're right. Like there hasn't been a lot of mention of this. We know that he's got candidates that he likes. Beyond that, there really isn't much more to say, unfortunately. Like I said, I think 10 days or so we'll have a head coach. He needs to have it, or not head coach. We'll have a hire at the assistant position.
And hope
you want to have this done when recruiting period opens up because it's not only just for 2023. It's also an opportunity to go out and make in-school visits to 2024, 2025, 2026 players. And while you can send a guy like Tyler Dean, who's like the director of scouting at Oregon, on these trips, you'd ideally like to tap into your position coach to do that as well, because he may have a better connection or he may know have a relationship with a high school coach or something that can foster a quicker relationship with the player than Tyler Dean. I'm not trying to discredit Tyler Dean because he's really good at his job, but you'd rather have your position coach out there.
Yeah, 100%. And I'd be kind of curious to see where this goes. I wonder if they'll find another Texas representative basically on defense. They have obviously Will Stein and Drew Maringer, guys with backgrounds in Texas on offense. Defensively, Matt Powledge was kind of their guy from a recruiting perspective. He was a big part of a lot of those recruitments. I know Tosh is pretty well connected around the country and helped kind of finish on some of those defensive line players along with Tuioti. But I think Powledge, with his connections in Texas, was really valuable in terms of recruiting the state of Texas. So defensively, I think you'd like to find somebody on the staff who's got a history there, direct ties to Texas, or somewhere in that region at least, because that remains an area. Like Oregon hit Texas harder this year than they have in a really long time. And the state of Texas, I'll tell you, every year it's going to have a ton of dudes.
Have some dudes. Yeah.
And if you can keep hitting those and landing, again, I think the exciting part about this year in Texas, a lot of those are blue chip guys. A lot of those are 4-star recruits that had offers from a lot of really big time schools. So to me, that's like, I know it's one qualification, but I would like expect, I would be a little surprised, I guess, if this hire didn't hit home from a different geographical area, I guess. Like, I'd be surprised if this is a guy who's also from Southern California, like Demetrius Martin, who coaches corners. Tosh is from the West Coast originally. Tony Tuioti is from the West Coast originally. So your defensive staff is mostly West Coast guys. I think you need to hit somebody who's got a little history outside the region, who's got some background, some ties somewhere else. That would be kind of the thing I would look for on this one.
Two other real quick things here. One, maybe Oregon opens up to a different position group because Demetrius Martin does have experience coaching both safeties and cornerbacks. I would still think you want to keep status quo as it was last year and have a safeties coach, but maybe that's an avenue. And then secondly, they're going to have some money to use because Powledge was paid $700,000 before bonuses this season. Chunk. That's a big chunk of money. So they should, in theory,
That's a lot of money for a safeties coach.
He was co-DC.
I know he was co-DC, yeah, but that's just a title. It's more of just a safeties coach. That $700,000 brought him to Oregon originally. That's for sure.
Yeah, so you're gonna have a lot of money to use for your search for a new head coach or a new position coach.
Matt, stop putting that out there.
Are we?
I'm sorry, Dan's gone.
Dan here.
God.
Oh God!
Not
Can you imagine
a head coaching search, by the way, for those listening. That's why I reacted that way. It's the worst thing to cover. It's exhausting. So please no more of that. Dan, please, like Eugene, stay in Eugene. Yeah, I don't have my.
That'd be great. Yeah, no more coaching searches, please.
Yeah,
head coaching searches, to be specific, because never a good time. Never a good time.
All right, I think that's going to do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Please pray that I have the internet power to get this podcast up online. We'll see if that happens. But thank you for listening. Thank you for submitting your questions to the show. We'll continue to do these every Friday, or maybe we'll move them around. But I think the plan is we stick on Friday as best we can. Until the next one, you've been listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Talk to you later, folks.
Peace.